Hello again, and this is the first of a series of talks about specific aspects of research appraisal. Now, in order to appraise research, we also need to know how to produce it. So let's look at the anatomy of writing for publication a scientific paper. It all really started in 1665 when the physicist from Cambridge, Robert Boyle, and his colleagues met together and founded the first scientific journal. What became the Royal Society for the Study of Science issued its first volume of the Philosophical Transactions in 1665, and the PhilTrans has been publishing ever since. And it established a model because right from the start they used peer review. In other words, other people interested in science would read the papers and comment on their suitability for publication in the journal. And that is a model that has endured right up to the present day. And it has endured even the digital revolution, which has now very much changed the way that we produce journals. So there is a diagram, there is a picture of one of the first papers in the Philosophical Transactions. And the first thing we can see about it is that really the form hasn't changed very much at all. There is a title, an abstract, and a series of columns in which the material is written up just as it would be in a modern scientific journal, whether or not that is a printed one or one that is purely issued in digital form. And you can go to the website of the Royal Society and look at the transactions as they are in the modern day. They've now split into two parallel journals because the amount of material that they publish is very, very much larger than it was in 1665. But nevertheless, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society is well, and it is proceeding, and it publishes at regular intervals into the present century. And there, in fact, the Transactions Part B. As we saw, Part A is the mathematical, physical and engineering sciences, and Part B is reserved for the biological sciences. So, scientific papers appear mostly in peer-reviewed journals, and the peer review process is a means of guaranteeing the legitimacy and the value of the work that is published. A scientific paper is very much the end product of research, and therefore all that work, the preparation, the laboratory work, the field work, the analysis, the writing up, it all finally crystallizes in the form of the academic paper. And the academic paper, once published, adds to the store of knowledge, scientific knowledge, that humanity can draw upon to resolve its problems. So peer review is the process of controlling the quality of scientific publication. And if a paper does not pass peer review, then logically it will not be published, and the author will be informed why. So imagine that you are a scientist and you have carried out some research. You identified a problem to solve. You formulated a hypothesis, which is effectively a sort of hunch that you go out to test or verify. You perhaps make models in this process in order to simplify a complex reality, and you do your research, and at the end of it, you have a message that you are very keen to convey to those who would want to read it, your peers, and you write it up, therefore, as a scientific paper. Scientific research has to build upon the existing body of knowledge. There is virtually no research which is conducted in a vacuum. All of it must take account of what has already been done and what has already appeared in the scientific literature. But nevertheless, on the basis of what there is, on the basis of past work, you have to exercise your creativity and produce something that has the quality of originality, but at the same time, it is robust. In other words, your work is verifiable independently. Not that that is often done, but at least we can comfort ourselves with the fact that if the work is good, then it is perfectly possible to go back and redo it and verify the conclusions. We trust that the conclusions follow logically from the work and that the work itself is logically constructed, that there aren't inconsistencies in it, that where things are measured, where analysis is done, in both cases it is accurate, that the interpretations are correct, that objectivity reigns in the work, and eventually that the conclusions could be judged to be true, regardless of what they are. And so, you decide that you're going to write up your research. You've done an analysis of data that you have collected, you have come to conclusions, you have some ideas, and you then have to decide, well, how are you going to present this to your sponsors or your public or those who must judge you? It could be in the form of a report. Usually reports are a little more informal than peer-reviewed research, although it is not uncommon these days for reports themselves to be peer-reviewed. Now, if you have a very great deal of material to present, you might do so in the form of an entire book, and we would call that a scholarly monograph. If you have much less to produce, or you want to produce a summary of what you've done, then a single sheet of A1 paper, either in portrait or landscape format, could be sufficient, in which case you would be producing a poster that you would exhibit at some scientific meeting, perhaps a large plenary conference. And those who read your poster and look at it, you perhaps would be on hand at certain times to explain to them if they have any questions and answer the questions, all about what your research is about. Now, if you merely have a small amount of research or you're perhaps not completely finished with your work, then you might submit an abstract and do a conference presentation, and you might be required to produce not an abstract of standard form, which is about 250 words, in other words, rather short, but an extended abstract of anything up to 3 pages. An alternative to that is to make a comment on previous work or on a particular situation and send it to a scientific publication, a journal, in the form of a letter to the editor. Some journals publish letters to editors, some don't, but those that do would consider publishing your letter as part of correspondence, which is probably something that will be in a particular section of the journal, and would contribute to the scholarly and scientific debate on the topics you're interested in. If you have perhaps a small piece of work that is rather concentrated and is based on a piece of analysis, then perhaps you might write up a short paper which is in the form of a technical note. Perhaps it discusses a technique of analysis or a piece of equipment, or perhaps it's a field report where you are simply commenting on something you have encountered in a field situation whilst collecting data. Now, those tend to be fairly short papers. They might be a few pages long when they're finally published, but the most common, the most numerous, and generally the end goal of all of this is the full-scale scientific paper published in a peer-reviewed journal, and perhaps a journal of some considerable repute. So most scientific papers are self-contained works. On occasion, they may have multiple parts, usually not more than 2, but occasionally even 3 or 4. And this would imply that there is a great deal of work to present, not enough for a book, a monograph, but certainly enough to produce a variety of different parts that fit together as the paper, part 1, part 2, and so on. Fortunately for editors, these are pretty uncommon, and the vast majority of papers are a single self-contained work, perhaps of between 6,000 and 9,000 words, which explains from beginning to end the research and its outcome. So, in fact, that brings us on to a short discussion of the length of a full scientific paper. Perhaps the standard length is about 6,000 or 7,000 words, and some journals propose limits. For example, the journal Disaster Prevention and Management will not publish anything over 7,000 words long, and that includes the references, tables, figure captions, abstract, and all the rest. Other journals are perhaps a little more lenient about length. A short paper might be of the order of 2,000 to 4,000 words, and journals like Nature, which are extremely popular, and Science in the United States, Science magazine, mainly publish fairly short contributions because that way they can publish more and they can cover more of the range of scientific endeavour. Even so, the vast majority of what is submitted to them, they turn down. And if you've written a paper and submitted it to a journal and it's 12,000 words long, then you'll probably find that the reviewers complain this paper could be cut by a third and still give the same amount of knowledge and information. So in point of fact, referees dislike long papers, and who can blame them? They have to wade through the paper and read it from end to end, and it's more of a chore if the paper is long. So there is a virtue in brevity. Too much brevity, of course, and you are skipping over things and being superficial, but very often there's little excuse for writing something that is long-winded. Bearing in mind also that there may be references, anything between about 20 and 60, 70, 80 references. Perhaps the papers that are reviews of particular topics and subjects are those that are likely to have the largest number of citations in them and references in the list at the end. There will be an abstract of about 250 words and keywords also, perhaps half a dozen of them. There will be figures possibly and tables where data need to be presented or models or situations need to be illustrated. And in some cases there may be appendices, these may be extra data, or they may be descriptions of algorithms and so on and so forth. Indeed, there are now journals that exist to publish only the data so that in fact you can link the scientific paper to a presentation of your data for the benefit of other scientists. This is a fairly new development linked to the use of hypertext and the fact that so much publication now is largely digital. So, how long does a scientific paper need to be? Well, here we are. We have a range that goes from 2,000 words to 10, 11, 12,000. And that really doesn't tell us how long the work actually needs to be. But really, the rule of thumb is that the paper needs to be as long as it needs to be. Now, I know that's not very helpful, but the point is you have to get the message across. And how should you do so without exaggerating or without skimping? So shorter papers are often more appreciated by readers because they have to do less work to get to the end of them. On the other hand, you don't want to leave a reader wondering, well, isn't there more to this? Isn't there something missing here? So really you have to try to strike a happy medium between making a paper too long because you're afraid of leaving things out and making it too short because you're afraid of boring the reader. And so to the structure of a typical research paper. Here's the part of the first page of one of mine, published in the year 2000. And what do we see? Well, the title and the author and the affiliation of the author. These days, probably somewhere, possibly at the foot of the page, there would be the author or the lead author's email address. We call the lead author the corresponding author, and we would list all authors here. Many papers are written by teams or pairs or groups of individuals rather than by single authors. We do have a tendency in certain sciences for papers to be nominally written by vast numbers of authors. And I saw a case in Nature where, in fact, there are about 1,300 authors. But I think this really is ridiculous and excessive. Fortunately, most papers have only a handful of authors at the most, if they are not single-authored. The next thing is an abstract, and the abstract should summarize the content of the paper. The abstract is not an introduction. It is instead a précis or summary of everything that's in the paper in but a few words. Many journals will then follow that by keywords. In other words, which terms characterize what's in the paper. And there might be 4, 5, 6 keywords which enable indexers and searchers to find the paper easier if they're looking for a paper that will respond to a particular key term. Then we have the introduction and the matter of the paper begins. So I've just discussed some of the preliminaries of this process: title, authors, affiliations, coordinates, principally email address, and then the abstract. Not a very long abstract generally, because it needs to be readable quickly and it needs to simply to summarize. It does not explain, it summarizes, and then the key words. Now, when you submit a paper, you might need to put some of that on a separate title page, because it is possible that your work will go out to anonymous reviewers without your name on it, so that they are not biased by knowing who you are and being able to refer to your past works or anything that you've done in your professional life. Many other journals don't do it this way. They have half-blind review rather than double-blind, or single-blind is another word for it. Double-blind means that the reviewers don't know who the author is, the author doesn't know who the reviewers are. Single-blind simply means that the reviewers are not made known to the author, but the author is known to the reviewers. And by and large, it's often easy to work out who an author is, even if they're not named on the piece of paper, on the paper that you get. So, the body of the paper will probably go through a series of logical sections, which will be something like this. We introduce the research questions, we state any hypotheses, and perhaps we explain the field area or the laboratory technique, depending on whether we're dealing with data derived from fieldwork or from a laboratory experiment or something like that. Not all papers have to have data. Some are reviews of particular arguments or questions or developments and so on. But many, of course, are empirically based, and they would have data from the field or the laboratory. Then we go on to the methodology. Even papers that are mere reviews of other scientific work have a methodology usually. In other words, how did they find the work? How did they assess what has been written? And those papers that are based upon fieldwork or laboratory experiments will certainly need to explain what methodology was employed in order to derive the results. Then there'll be a section in which comments are made upon the process of analysing the data, and the results are presented. Probably after that, the slightly wider significance of the results will be discussed in a discussion section, which, among other things, will interpret the results and also explain the results in relation to other literature. In other words, it will help to explain how the results contribute to the general scientific literature and help to push forward the boundaries of science. Finally, conclusions, which should be more or less short, which will draw the threads together, explain in simple terms what the achievement of the work is, and also perhaps make a comment on what needs to be done next and where we stand in the progression of science with respect to the argument that has been tackled in the paper. Now, there may be additions to this basic structure, which include, for example, acknowledgements, who funded the research or who helped with it, or did any colleagues read an early draft of it and make comments on that? And they perhaps should be acknowledged in a very short section that comes after the conclusions. We then move to the list of citations, the references, so anything referred to in the text will be then listed in the references, which will be complete and full. If there are appendices with perhaps more on the methodology or presentation of data or something like that, then they will follow. Figures and tables will be placed within the text, although as they often need to be submitted to a journal separately, then they may be reproduced at the end of the manuscript for the benefit of the reviewers. They will then be typeset into the text so that they appear in the right place in the narrative. Okay, let's consider some issues associated with clarity. Now, clarity has two main sides to it. One is the intellectual side and the other is the physical side. I think it is quite important that the physical presentation of a paper be clear. For example, here is a screenshot from one of my own manuscripts where I've used a sans serif type font, Arial, In other words, it's easy to read. The page is numbered, the pages are numbered, and the lines are numbered, although I haven't used intrusive line numbering. I've used lines numbered every 5 lines. So we've got 40, 45, 50, 55, and so on. And this will enable the reviewers to refer to particular statements that I make and say, for example, in line 40, you talk about the modern PhD degree, and so on. So if they need to locate their comments with respect to my text, then they can do so with the aid of the page numbering and line numbering that I have provided. Also, I've tried to ensure that the text is not cluttered so that they can read it easier without having to heave a sigh and decode it. So perhaps the paper will be submitted to a journal and it will go to peer review. Peer review is the process whereby bona fide scientists, in other words, our peers in the scientific arena, who are judged knowledgeable about the topic of the paper, will be contacted by the editor of the journal and asked to make a review of the manuscript, usually within a period of about 4 weeks, and submit their comments and a judgment as to whether the paper is publishable or not, and perhaps whether it's publishable with certain modifications. Now, we do this for free. Occasionally there are incentives such as improved access to the journal and so on, but we are not paid for this service. And it is a quid pro quo service. In other words, we do it for others under the assumption that they will do it for us. So I will review other people's papers and I have a sort of moral obligation to do so. Other people in science will submit papers and it will be up to me to review them, but I would also hope that they would be willing to review my papers. Hopefully objectively, not as part of a coterie or club where we each pass each other's papers for publication without too much thought or criticism. On the contrary, as it happens, most science is fiercely critical and therefore there really isn't much sense of papers being published by a cosy club. Rather, instead, it is quite a difficult process to get past the reviewers. So I mentioned the single-blind and double-blind sorts of reviewing. Very occasionally, the reviewers' names are known to the authors and the authors' names are known to the reviewers. A perfectly open review system which is designed to discourage harsh or unfair criticism, but to ensure that the author gets the benefit of a full contact with the reviewers, and where we have an unblinded review system, the author might even be encouraged to contact personally the reviewers for further clarification or debate. Journals that have a single blind or possibly even a double blind form of reviewing may in the end ask the reviewer if he or she minds whether his or her identity is made known to the authors. There are reasons why one wouldn't wish that to be the case. For example, some authors can be vindictive about unpleasant reviews, and therefore one would prefer to hide behind the cloak of anonymity, which gives one a certain freedom to say what one thinks. On the other hand, it also is a freedom that can be abused. Many journals also publish a list of referees without saying what the individuals have reviewed, perhaps once a year, in thanks for their help with the improvement of the quality of the journal. So you're confronted with somebody's work, a paper that has been submitted to the journal that the editor has asked you to review. What do you then do? Well, you make comments on it, you go through it, and you make both general comments and possibly specific comments about the language, the style of communication, and the scientific content of it. And at the end, you get a series of choices about what you should recommend to the editor about the publishability of the paper. Is it so good that it really needs no modification and can be accepted just as it is? Is it pretty good, but there are one or two things that could be tweaked and sharpened up a bit, such that if the author dedicates half an hour or so, or 2 hours or something to minor improvements, then it can be resubmitted and go straight into production, minor revision in other words. Is it a fundamentally sound paper, but it's got quite a few things that are wrong with it or not good enough, suboptimal, in which case we might recommend major revision or even a complete rewrite, in which case the author has a more serious task ahead of him or her, in which the paper has to be substantially rejigged before it is resubmitted. And the final category, well, two final categories. One is reject. In other words, the paper is simply not good enough. And if the author wants to write something good enough, then he or she should start again rather than modifying the present manuscript. Or that whether or not, regardless of whether it's a good paper or not, it simply doesn't fit the scope of the journal. Now, it may be that the editor has already determined that and therefore won't send a paper out for review. On the other hand, sometimes it is necessary for a greater expert in the particular topic to be able to say to the editor, look, I've read this through, it is or it is not a good enough paper, but it really doesn't fit what you normally publish in this journal. So from the point of view of the author, it is quite important to find the right home for your paper. It's not only a question of writing a good paper, but it's also a question of submitting it to the right place where the reviewers and the editor will feel comfortable in dealing with it, and not that it is simply something that is out of scope. So we get some quite substantial comments on a paper, and some of them can indeed be harsh. For example, consider this one. The main objective of this paper, as stated in the abstract and introduction, is to, well, blah, blah, blah. This is an important problem. However, nowhere in this manuscript is this idea properly demonstrated. The manuscript consists of a series of successive examples of well-known methods, largely already published in other journals. The manuscript is merely a case study, and none of the methods and information or results is new or original. Okay, well, in cases like that, what the reviewer is trying to get across with no uncertain terms is that the paper is simply not good enough because it doesn't say anything that is worth considering as an addition to size. It doesn't push forward the boundaries, it merely rehashes. Alternatively, the reviewer might say anything about it. It's good, it's bad, it's indifferent, but suggest that the authors really ought to submit it to a more appropriate journal. And in fact, it is most common for authors to choose the wrong outlet for their work. A personal case of this, I submitted a paper to the journal Risk Analysis, which is pretty well known and pretty well regarded as a journal. And it came back from the editor rejected fairly quickly, and the editor said, there's no risk analysis in this paper. Well, admittedly, when I submitted it, I was putting the fox among the chickens, because the whole point of the paper was to demonstrate a case where, for various reasons, it was a matter of unexploded bombs, actually. Risk analysis was impossible. But they didn't like it. What they wanted were papers where there is a risk analysis, and they weren't interested in publishing one which said the opposite. In cases like that, this risk analysis isn't possible. And by the way, the reason why it wasn't possible is because of the unexploded bombs. Any attempt to get information about them could lead to them going off. So that was a case where perhaps it was simply the wrong outlet, and in fact the paper will go back to somewhere else where perhaps it is likely to be treated with more favour. Often when I review, I find myself in a situation where the manuscript simply is not original enough, and it all reminds me of the great lexicographer and literary gentleman Samuel Johnson, who in reading somebody's work said, your manuscript is both good and original, but the part that is good is not original, and the part that is original is not good. Variations on this have been used ever since. For example, the brother of the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Niels Bohr, who was also a physicist, had it said about his PhD thesis, sir, there is much in your thesis that is new, and there is much that is original. Unfortunately, that which is original is not new, and that which is new is not original. And how can one be more damning? But unfortunately, there are many instances in science where phrases, dictums of this kind are the case. So there we have Niels Bohr and his brother. He did eventually get his PhD. He was able to rejig it a bit, resubmit it, and everything was all right. And that was around 1919. We could go back further in time to the time of Marshall and his epigrams, in which cur non micto meos tibi Pontiliane libellos, ne mihi tu mitas Pontiliane tuos. Why don't I send you my books? Lest you should send me yours, Pontilianus. Lest you should send me yours. Okay, what about the physical process of submitting an article? Nowadays, we virtually always do so electronically. Gone are the days where we had to go down to the post office or the post room and send 4 photocopied copies or even carbon copies before the advent of photocopiers to the editor, who would send them out by post to potential reviewers. Now everything is done online, and many journals have stopped even printing the journal itself. They do everything digitally. The peer review, how long does it take? Well, the shortest I've ever seen it take is a week, but that was virtually miraculous. The average time for the journal I edit is about 54 days. It can take months. In some disciplines, it even takes years, although I'm blessed if I know why. So perhaps within a couple of months or 3 months, we're able to conclude the peer review process. We have judgments. The editor can make a decision on the paper, and if he or she does not reject it, then there will be a process whereby the author is invited to revise and resubmit the paper. Now, some editors will send the revised paper out for further review, either to the same people who reviewed it before or to new reviewers. And of course, we are dependent on the reviewers agreeing to do the work, bearing in mind that they're not paid for it and they're not under contract. Hopefully, though, whether or not the article is re-reviewed and further modifications are made to it, it is accepted. It will then go into production, and after a certain amount of time, short or long, proofs will be issued, all of it electronically. The author will get the chance to correct any mistakes in the proof, although not to make any major changes in the article, and the article itself will be published in the journal, given page numbers and made part of a volume and possibly also an issue. And it will look something like this. So there we have the published article in the form that you would expect to see it in the journal, whether electronic or printed. We also have the question of open access. Publishing is not something that is free. It incurs costs. Now, it is true that you can sacrifice your time and set up a website and use a bit of software and produce your own journal and publish your own work or someone else's as you please. But the large, the prestigious, and the important journals are largely produced by fairly giant multinational publishers with a large number of staff and a very substantial enterprise, and that is not a free process. Now, you can complain as much as you like about the amount of profit that commercial publishers make, and you may very well have reason for it. But what you cannot get away from is that publishing is not a cost-free process, which means that somebody has to pay for it. So many journals are behind paywalls where you can only get access to the material if you pay for it, which is why the budgets of libraries, academic libraries, are very much dominated by the need to pay for bundles of journals from the major publishers so that staff and students get access to the material. Alternatively, for a sum that usually varies between $1,000 and $3,000 US, you can purchase open access for your article, in which case there is no paywall and anyone in the world can download it, providing they have an internet access. Research projects will often pay for open access, and there is a move to try to make all science open access, except that it does have to contend with the issue of how we pay for the process of publication, if we ever get to the point where everything is open access. There is a site run by the multinational publishers Elsevier called The Article of the Future, in which they have tried to investigate how things are changing in the publishing world. We've already had a massive revolution caused by information technology. Things now are very different and they're changing very, very dynamically in academic publishing. Moreover, the amount that is published is vastly, vastly greater than it was even 20 years ago, let alone 40 or 60 years ago. So there is a tendency to scan the horizon and to ask, well, how will things be in the future? Will we still have that format we started with today, namely the same kind of publication as the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society 1665? We probably will to some extent, but there are certainly new developments such as hyperlinks, the possibility of including video, links to other journals, other publications, data sets, appendices, methodologies, web pages, demonstrations, and so on, such that the nature of the product is very much more expanded. It could conceivably be very much more sophisticated than it was with simply a manuscript that then appeared in print. So we wonder, what will scientific articles look like in 25 years' time? Well, the digital revolution will continue to produce surprises and changes dynamically. Digital content is being added to papers in the ways I've just described, the videos, the data banks, the hyperlinks, and so on. And some people are beginning to ask, will we still need scientific articles, or will there be different ways of accessing scientific information? Well, bearing in mind that the standard scientific paper has existed virtually unchanged since the middle of the 17th century, I would say that it's still got a lot of life in it and that it is not going to disappear within the next 25 years. But nevertheless, a lively and interesting future is in front of us. So thank you for listening.